Well, thank you, Pastor, and welcome back after your lunch. You enjoy your lunch? Yeah. That's good. That's good. And thank everybody who brings food for sharing it, because it's nice. You know, some churches, they call it potluck, but I don't like that term, because we don't believe in luck so much as God's blessings. And so I prefer the term fellowship lunch, which I think is what you've used here, isn't it? It's a fellowship time to share together. And as Luca was telling us this morning in the Sabbath school, that God designs relationships. That's what happened at creation, was a relationship with everything. And lunchtime together is an opportunity to strengthen those relationships, isn't it? So thank you, Errol, for leading us in those breathtaking exercises. And we're going to move on now into the book of Revelation, and we're really getting on now into the book of Revelation, as you know. We've started last week into the prophetic section, and we're now coming to the real heavy meat. This morning's session, for those of you who are here, will realize how heavy it is, and it's going to get heavier. I tell you. So that's why it's important to try and follow each of the series, because you lose the connection, then you have a job to put them together. However, we're here to help you, and if you have any questions afterwards, as Pastor said, we'll have that opportunity to do so. So let's move in to our subject, and we're going into the 8th chapter of Daniel this afternoon. But let's just review what we did in Daniel 7. We covered Daniel 7 last Sabbath afternoon and this morning. So let's just recap on that to start with. And those of you who were here last week, when we started Daniel 7, you will remember that the first half of Daniel is the description of what Daniel saw in vision. And then the second half is the explanation that the angel gave to Daniel. So in the description, we read it through on the screen. I'm just going to sum it up for you. Once again, those who are here this morning will remember we did this. First of all, in Daniel 7, the vision was of the four winds, that's north, east, south and west, stirring there up the Mediterranean Sea, the Great Sea. And winds represent war and strife and trouble. And the four great beasts arose out of the sea as a result of those warfares, representing the four great kingdoms the angel told Daniel that came in succession. First of all, there was the lion with eagle's wings, representing the Babylonian Empire. And you remember when we went to Babylon last week, I showed you the glazed tiles that are now in the Pergamon Museum in Berlin, which once lined the famous Ishtar Gate of Babylon. And amongst those tiles, you remember, were not only the Siriuses, these mystic creatures, but there was also the Lion of Babylon with the eagle's wings. And in the book of Jeremiah, the lion and the eagle, the king of beasts, the king of birds, are both used to represent ancient Babylon. And so, first of all, we had the lion with eagle's wings, and that was followed by the bear that was lopsided, representing the empire of Medo-Persia. We'll come back to Medo-Persia this afternoon. And then that was followed by Greece, represented by the four-headed leopard with the wings of a fowl. And then, as we studied this afternoon, the nondescript beast, that rather ferocious-looking creature. As I said earlier, don't go away and have nightmares after seeing this one. One little boy told his parents last week, when they said, "What did you enjoy about it last week?" He said, "The pictures of the beast on the screen." I thought, well, that's interesting, isn't it? I hope he didn't have nightmares after that. But it's just an artist's impression of this ferocious beast that represented the Empire of Rome. Now, you notice that beast had 10 horns, representing the 10 divisions that the Western Empire of Rome was fragmented into as the Aryan hordes came down, these barbarians from the northeast region, and settled in the Western Empire, thus forming the major nations of Europe as we know them today. But 3 of those were plucked up by the roots, as the prophecy said, to make way for that little horn that had eyes of a man and a mouth speaking great things, and we identified that as the papers say. And I just want to say now, for any person who was here today who didn't hear what I said this morning, that when I talk about the papacy, I'm not referring to individuals. I want to make that very clear, because I found some very genuine, devout people amongst Roman Catholics. Some very good people, and I've had some good friends, good relationships with a number of Roman Catholics. But it's not the people, it's the system that we're talking about. And when we talk about the system of the papacy, we have to touch on some things that might or could be offensive to some people. And by sharing true facts, historical facts, supported by even their own statements, we have to be prepared and big enough to recognize that. But I'm not talking about individuals, I'm not condemning individuals, because they are devout people. But this little horn came up in their place. And then, after the little horn was established, the judgment took place, and that's when the beast and the little horn were destroyed, and Christ set up his kingdom. So that is the sequence of the prophecy, and I want you to bear that in mind, friends, because it is so, so important to remember that. Because as we go through the book of Daniel, we are actually following that sequence. And we're getting further along the line towards the latter part, and we shall in fact be talking about the judgment next week in the afternoon program. So we are moving right up towards the final climax as portrayed here in these prophecies. So it is very important for us to notice the time of the visions that we have been talking about here. First of all, the vision of Daniel chapter 7. When was it given? Well, it tells us there in Daniel 7 and verse 1 that it took place in the first year of King Belshazzar. All right? Now, who was Belshazzar? Well, his father was a Babylonian king, Nabonidus. And Nabonidus, he succeeded his father Nebuchadnezzar. Okay? So after Nebuchadnezzar passed the scene of life, Nabonidus took the throne. But he was not so interested in ruling. He was more interested in the arts and in cultures and in travel and expeditions and archaeology and things of this nature. And so he acceded the throne in 555 BC, but he appointed his son Belshazzar as the co-ruler with him. So Belshazzar became the second ruler in 553 BC. That's why when Belshazzar saw the handwriting on the wall, he promised that whoever interpreted that writing would be made the third ruler in the kingdom. He couldn't be the second because Belshazzar was the second. Nabonidus was the first, Belshazzar the second, and so he promised the third ruler. So the vision of Daniel 7 was given during the first year of Belshazzar, which would then fall been around the period 553, 552, in that sort of region of time. Now, why am I telling you this? Because of what's going to come in a few moments. Let's notice. The vision of Daniel 8, that was given in the third year of the reign of King Belshazzar, 2 years later after he came to the throne, which would be 550 BC. All right? So bear that in mind, because when we look at this, we realize that God was able to foretell ahead of time the kingdoms that were coming, but he also mentioned them by name. That's interesting, isn't it? Do you remember I told you about Cyrus when he took Babylon? God foretold through the prophet Isaiah about 150 years beforehand that it would be the Persians who would come take Babylon, they'd leave the sluice gates open, they'd marched up into the city in a dry riverbed, and he even named that the one who came would be Cyrus. Even before Cyrus was born, God was able to do that, because God is the God who is omniscient. One of his abilities is that he can see into the future. He knows the course that each one of us will take in the future. And so God was able to disclose that, and this helps to confirm the accuracy of the Bible when we see it fulfilled in history. And so 12 years before Babylon fell, God was able to disclose to Daniel, as we shall see, what he did. So it is important, therefore, to recognize that Daniel received the prophetic vision of chapter 8, which we're going to look at today, when the Babylonian Empire was still in existence. All right? So let's move now into the vision of Daniel chapter 8. Now, in verse 1 tells us it was the second year of his reign, okay? Was it the third year of his reign? So Daniel 2 now, verse 2 says, in the vision I was looking, and I saw myself in Susa, the capital in the province of Elam. The capital of this province was Susa. And so in vision he was transported to that place. And he says, I was by the river Ulai. And in vision Daniel was at Susa. Shushan is also another name for it there in that great metropolis. Now, the river Ulai, sometimes referred to as Eleucus, was a canal, a man-made canal that connected two rivers, the river Corprates and the river Coaspes, so that they were linked together. Okay? So he was there by this canal, if you like, and while he was in vision by this canal, he goes on to say, in the vision I was looking and saw myself in Susa, the capital in the province of Elam, and I was by the river Ulai, and I looked up and saw a ram standing beside the river. It had two horns. Both horns were long, but one was longer than the other, and the longer one came up second. And he goes on, he says, I saw the ram charging westward and northward and southward, and all beasts were powerless to withstand it, and no one could rescue from its power. It did as it pleased, and it became strong. Now, in verse 20 is the explanation. This is the description in the first half of chapter 8, like chapter 7 is the description of what he saw. Then the angel comes and explains it to Daniel in vision. So in verse 20, he tells him what this ram represents. Okay? So here it is. Verse 20, as for the ram that you saw with the two horns, these are the kings of Media and Persia. All right? Excuse me. Remember, that was given some 12 years before this took place. Yes. 12 years before it took place. So as for the ram that you saw with the two horns, these represent the kingdom. That the word kings means kingdom of Media and Persia. Now, under Cyrus the Great, Persia became the strongest of the two kingdoms. To start with, Media was the stronger one. But gradually, Persia took the ascendancy, and Media began to fade into insignificance. So, therefore, what we refer to as Medo-Persia initially later became known as just as Persia, the Persian Empire. All right? Now then, let's move on. Because, you know, it's interesting, they crowned their kings in Persia with a ram's head of gold, with precious stones. Now you will notice here that the beasts change from wild beasts, because what kingdom in chapter 7, or what animal I mean, represented the kingdom of Medo-Persia in chapter 7? Do you remember? No, that was Babylon. The lion? The bear, somebody said. Yes, the bear. The lopsided bear. Lopsided because Persia was in the ascendancy. So it's changing now from ferocious beasts to more placid type of beasts. Though you might not think that so much when you see the next one, but they're more placid. The reason for this is Daniel 8 now changes a spiritual position, or to a more spiritual position. We will come back into this next week when we talk about the defiling of the sanctuary. But in Daniel chapter 1 to 7, it's written in Aramaic. We move to chapter 8 through to the end of the book of Daniel, it's in Hebrew. Hebrew is the religious language of the Jews even to today. All right? It's moving into sanctuary language, and the symbolism becomes sanctuary symbolism. All right? More of that next week. But here it's important to notice that God is using these symbols, and they're very fitting in the use they have. And the Persians crowned their kings with a ram's head of gold with precious stones in it. And the coins carried a ram's image, as we see here on the screen. But this picture of this coin that I'd lean is a Persian, a Greek one. It goes back to, it's a picture of Alexander the Great, his successor, the successive kingdom, with horns on. It's a Thracian coin of the 3rd century BC, which is even later than Alexander. It reflects belief in his kingship to Ammon, the ram-horned Egyptian god. You remember Ammon-Ra, the sun god, as well. So the idea of the ram, the sacred ram, was very pertinent in the ancient world, and the Persians did a similar thing. So here Daniel saw in vision the ram charging westward and northward and southward, and all beasts were powerless to withstand it, and no one could rescue from its power. It did as it pleased, and he says it became strong. So he says, I saw the ram charging westward and northward and southward. That's because he was coming from the east. You don't charge eastward if you're coming from the east, do you? But he was charging westward, northward, and southward. And it says all the beasts were powerless to withstand it, which shows that he was now conquering. And he says the ram was charging, let's come back to this, we'll come back to that later. The ram was charging westward and northward and southward. Now, let's just look at the map here, because this gives us some concept of the extent of the Persian Empire. The Babylonian Empire, if you can see the little red dot on the screen here, it would occupy just a smaller region around that sort of area. But now we're coming out further into this region, all the way to Libya and up around there, Cappadocia. So the Persian Empire is the largest empire up to this particular time. And in West, he's conquering Babylonia, Mesopotamia, and Syria. And then he's going northward, conquering Armenia, and the area around the Caspian Sea, that's sort of Turkey and up towards Russia. And then, of course, southward, conquering Egypt, Palestine, Libya, and Ethiopia. Excuse me. And it says all the beasts were powerless to withstand it, because he was conquering these beasts, expanding his kingdom, and the kingdom of Persia was becoming the largest empire up to that time. Now, the overwhelming power then of Medo-Persia was so strong that no one could prevent its advancement. And Daniel goes on to say, as I was watching, a male goat appeared from the west, coming across the face of the whole earth, without touching the ground. And the goat had a horn between its eyes. It came toward the ram with the 2 horns that I had seen standing beside the river, and it ran at it with savage force. And the next verse goes on, and I saw it approaching the ram. It was enraged against it and struck the ram, breaking its 2 horns, and the ram did not have power to withstand it. It threw the ram down to the ground, trampled upon it, and there was no one who could rescue the ram from its power. That's the description of what he saw. Then the angel, in verse 21, he explains to him what the ram represents. Now remember, this was named 12 years before Persia came and took over, and now he's naming the empire that's going to follow some 200 or so years later down the line. And he says the male goat is the king of Greece. That's the kingdom of Greece. And he says the great horn between its eyes is the first king. All right, let's come to that in just a moment. So we have the symbol of the goat representing the Greek Empire. Now, friends, an ancient tradition claims that Cheremus, the first king of Macedon, he followed a herd of wild goats up to Edessa, where he established his capital, and it's called Aga, meaning the goat city, from where the national symbol emerged. So God was using, just as God used a lion with eagle wings to represent Babylon, God is using a goat to represent Greece. Some symbols that were very significant, even in future times that were to come at the time were given. All right. Now, the first king, the angel said, was represented by this notable horn between its eyes. And we know that the first king was Alexander. His father was Philip of Macedon. And Alexander, he succeeded his father to the throne of Macedon. But Macedon was just a little state within Persia. Now, he was going to become the founder of an even bigger empire than Persia, namely the Empire of Greece, the Greek Empire. So he's known as Alexander, he became known as Alexander the Great, okay? And history reveals him as Alexander the Great. Okay, so Daniel goes on, he says, as I was watching, a male goat, this is what we read before, read it again, a male goat appeared from the west, coming across the face of the whole earth without touching the ground. He appeared from the west. Notice the other one, the ram came from the east. I just want to make sure you haven't gone to sleep, you're listening, all right? Because I know after you've eaten a good meal, it's easy to fall asleep, isn't it, Pastor? Yeah. So he's not falling asleep, it's all right. But he came from the west, charging westward, northward, southward. Now Alexander, from the east. Alexander comes from the west. He's coming from the opposite direction. All right? So as I was watching, a male goat appeared from the west, coming across the face of the whole earth without touching the ground. That suggests speed, doesn't it? In Daniel 7, the four-headed leopard representing the Empire of Greece had how many wings? 4 wings of a fowl. Again, indicating speed. A very fast animal with 4 wings suggests speed. And here it's suggesting now this male goat is going so fast, he takes off. You know, he goes into the air without touching the air. It's almost as though he's been catapulted and he's flying through the air so fast. Significance on that, as we shall see. And the goat had horn between its eyes, and it came toward the ram, the 2 horns, and he ran at it with savage force. Right. So it's coming from the west. Now, as we said, both Babylon and Medo-Persia came from the east. The Greek Empire emerged from the west. And he says, as I was watching, he went so fast, it says, coming across the face of the earth without touching the ground, which suggests speed and aggression by which Alexander founded his empire, as we've just explained to you. All right, let's just notice some facts here. Alexander the Great, he came conquering Asia Minor, then Syria, then Phoenicia, Cyprus, Egypt, Babylonia, Persia, and the mountains of northern India. That's as far as he went. He took his troops as far east as the Indus River, which is one of the largest and longest rivers in Asia, almost 2,000 miles in length, when it flows from Tibet into Jammu and Kashmir, and on the rest goes through Pakistan there. So this is a tremendous distance that he marched his troops, and his troops finally refused to go any further, and they forced Alexander to return. So what actually happened in less than 10 years, Alexander the Great marched his troops more than 10,000 miles. Remember, they didn't have motorized tanks in those days. It was horseback and foot, and 10,000 miles, and he conquered the ancient world in just 10 years, forming the greatest empire ever known to that time, because he conquered the greatest empire, which was Persia, and he went even beyond and conquered more. So in this map you can see the extent of his empire. Here coming up to the Indus River here on the east. Asking you to see this red dot, I can hardly see it myself. Can you see it there? The Indus River, and coming all the way over, there's Macedon up there. That's where he came from. So this whole territory he conquered, the great empire of Greece, and thus he became known as Alexander the Great. Well, having reached the Indus River, his troops refused to go further. Alexander was forced to turn back, and he went back to the city of Babylon, because though the Babylon was conquered, the city was not destroyed. And he intended to make Babylon his headquarters. But he never succeeded, because within a few days he contracted swamp fever, probably malaria, and he died. And his death was no doubt complicated in dying, because he was an alcoholic, and he died in a drunken stupor within just a few days. In fact, it's been said of Alexander the Great that he conquered the world, but he failed to conquer himself. There's a great lesson there for every one of us, isn't there? All right. Then the prophecy goes on in the illustration. So you got the picture, this ram with two horns, both representing Media and then Persia, and the longer horn represents the Persian Empire. And then the he-goat comes from the opposite direction, from the west, so fast he's not even touching the ground, and he has this notable horn between his eyes that represents Alexander the Great, the first king of the empire, and he strikes this ram with anger and ferocity, that he smashes it to bits, and he forms the great empire of Greece. And then it tells us, after he'd done that, then the male goat grew exceedingly great, but at the height of its power, that's when he's now conquered the great empire, the great horn was broken, and in its place came up four prominent horns towards the four winds of the heaven. So at the height of its power, that little horn representing the first king, Alexander the Great, was broken. In other words, he died, as we mentioned. Excuse me. I've got an itch in my throat. I hope it's not a bit of the horn that's stuck in there. Might be a fragment, who knows. But he died at the height of his power, and in its place, it said, four prominent horns came up towards the four winds, north, east, south, and west. And so you notice here we have the height, the four heads of the leopard, representing the four, parallel, should I say, with the four horns that came up in place of the little one. In its place came up four prominent horns towards the four winds of heaven. So then it says, the male goat grew exceedingly great at the height of its power, and the great horn was broken. When Alexander was dying on his deathbed, his faithful servant Perdiccas asked him to whom he would bequeath his kingdom, and to which he replied, to the strongest. All right, famous words. It says in its place these four prominent horns towards the four winds of heaven. What actually happened? Well, the angel explained to Daniel, as for the horn that was broken, in place of which four others arose, four kingdoms shall arise from his nation, but not with his power. So these four kingdoms are going to arise out of the great empire of Greece. But they're not going to be in the same power that Alexander the Great is in. That's what it's saying, all right? And you can see the parallel there with the four heads of the leopard. Now, what actually happened was, after his death, his empire fell into disarray. There was a lot of infighting, there was strife, there was turmoil. resulting in the army being scattered about and the various cities of the empire being pillaged. It was a terrible mess. And so there was no successor to his throne that was appointed. And so what was happening, there was strife all the way around. And finally, 4 of his generals divided the empire between themselves in the 4 directions of the compass, north, east, south, and west. And so this is how it was divided. Lysimachus took the north, including Cappadocia, which today is Turkey and Thrace, and northern Asia Minor. And then Ptolemy took the south, which is Egypt and Palestine, and Cassander took Macedonia, Thessaly and Greece, and Seleucus took the east, including Babylonia, Persia, and Syria. So if we look at the map here, you can see how that was divided. It's in a sort of close-up. It's not an expanded version of the map. Close-up here. Lysimachus took this north area up here, and including this area in Turkey, Cappadocia, Thrace, northern Asia Minor. Ptolemy was down here in Egypt and up to Palestine, around there, and Cassander, he had Greece, Thessaly, and so on, Macedonia, and Seleucus formed the Seleucid kingdom out in the east, which to Babylonia, Persia, and Syria. Okay, so that's how his empire was divided. So let's just read that text again, verses 8 and 9. At the height of its power, that's the little horn, the notable horn representing Alexander the Great. At the height of its power, the great horn was broken, and in its place there came up 4 prominent horns toward the 4 winds of heaven. And out of one of them came another horn, a little one, which grew exceedingly great toward the south and toward the east and toward the beautiful land. So this little horn that we read of in chapter 7 comes back into prominence once again, but with a little bit more detail as to its origin. All right, let's have a look here. Let's come back to the platform that we looked at originally. It says there that Daniel 2 was the platform of a panoramic prophecy, very brief outline of the history from the time of Babylon right up to the coming of Christ's kingdom. When the stone, it's not shown in that picture, but you remember a stone cut out without hands, struck that image on the feet and grew into a great mountain and filled the whole earth, representing the coming of Christ. But you've got the 4 empires mentioned there, Babylon, but when chapter 8 comes into effect in 12 years' time, the Babylonian Empire will fall to the Medo-Persians. And then in 331 BC, Alexander the Great conquered that empire. And then Rome comes on the scene, and that is acknowledged around about the Battle of Pydna 168 BC, until the Western Empire began to fragment due to the barbarous hordes coming in that I told you about this morning. Well, you've seen the parallels in here in their magnification. And that Roman Empire that we see here is where we are now focusing on the little horn that came forward. So that little horn was of great concern to Daniel, because not only of what he was saying, the claims he made, but also what he was doing. And it's interesting, as it says there, as for the horn that was broken, that's Alexander, in his place came up these 4 separate kingdoms in which his empire was divided, but not in the same power. And then it says, at the end of their rule, when the transgressions have reached their full measure, a king of bold countenance shall arise, skilled in intrigue. And he goes on. And as for the horn that was at the end of their rule, when the transgressions have reached the full measure, a king of bold countenance shall arise, skilled with intrigue. And he goes on, he shall grow strong in power. He shall cause fearful destruction, and shall succeed in what he does. He shall destroy the powerful and the people of the holy ones. By his cunning he shall make deceit prosper under his hand, and in his own mind he shall be great. And without warning he shall destroy many, and shall even rise up against the Prince of Princes. Now who is the Prince of Princes? Jesus. He is spoken of as King of Kings and Lord of Lords. So this little horn power was to eventually rise up even against Jesus. Now you're going to hear some things next week when we look at what transpires here. But without warning he shall destroy many, and shall even rise up against the Prince of Princes, Jesus Christ. So let's notice, this prophecy states in Daniel chapter 8 verse 9 that this little horn power would grow exceedingly great toward the south, toward the east, and toward the beautiful land. This has to do with a power then that is much greater than its predecessor Greece, or even Rome itself, and Medo-Persia. But there is only one power that fulfills this prophecy. Just as it did in the four empires being succeeded in their succession, the little horn came up after the 10 was established, and as it did in chapter 2 and chapter 7. That power begins with Rome, because it belonged and was in the Roman Empire. And we know that the Romans were ruling during the time of Jesus when he came. When he was born, his parents had gone to Bethlehem because Joseph was of the line of David, and he had to go and register according to the Caesar's decree, Caesar of Rome. So Rome arose out of the remnants of the broken Greek Empire and came to the fore, as we've said, at the Battle of Pydna in 168 BC. And Egypt became a province of Rome in 30 BC. Now remember, BC time we're counting down. It's only in AD we count upwards. So about 150 years later, 130 years later, Egypt became a province of the Roman Empire. Rome conquered Syria in 65 BC, and Palestine came under the Roman Empire in 63 BC. And in AD 66, the armies of Rome marched against Jerusalem in response to the rebellion. The war lasted for 4 years, the War of the Jews. And finally in AD 70, under the command of Titus, the Roman legions stormed the walls and destroyed the city of Jerusalem, and the temple was destroyed for the final time. And so we see in the illustrations here, just reminding us, it was under the Roman rule that these things happened, and many of the Jewish survivors were taken to Rome as prisoners. So when it talks about it did things to God's holy people, it's not just talking about Christians, it's talking about the Jewish people as well. All right? The Roman power was doing this to the Jewish people, the ones who survived the Jewish wars, who were not, many of them were crucified. Is it Josephus? I think he mentions that they were crucified back to back around the walls of the city. There was no room. The Garden of Gethsemane, where all the olive trees, you go there and see the olive tree and you say, oh, they're old trees. And Jesus knelt here amongst these trees. He didn't. He knelt in the Garden of Gethsemane, but the trees that were there that Jesus saw were taken and they were destroyed. They used them to build crosses to nail the people to, and the whole thing was destroyed. They've been replanted since. Many Jewish survivors were taken to Rome as prisoners, and they were made to build the Colosseum, and in 8 years, if they hadn't died in building the Colosseum that time, they died in its arena. I tell you, friends, Rome was a persecutor of God's people. The dispersion of the Jews took place throughout the whole empire. So the Roman Empire is referred to as the kingdom of iron in Daniel 2. And in Daniel 7, the fourth beast representing that empire has great iron teeth, you remember. All right? And it was the time when Jesus was around. He waged bitter persecution of both the Jewish nation, and then after the death of Jesus, it waged persecution upon the Christian church as well. And the empire eventually broke into 10 kingdoms, as we related this morning. And so the little horn power pushed its way into the forefront, uprooting 3 of the 10 kingdoms in Daniel 7, and it came forward and started persecuting the Christians in the persecutions that followed. Now, unlike pagan Rome, this power was not just a political power. As the Bible said this morning, it was different from the others. It had temporal power and it had spiritual power, which it eventually exercised to the extent that people's free will was taken away. And so pagan Rome became ecclesiastical Rome. And so it also became a religious power, namely the apostate church, as portrayed there in chapter 7 and now in chapter 8. Now you're probably wondering what I'm saying here, because this morning we said that the little horn power rose at a certain period on the throne of Caesar in 538 AD. That is true. But let's not forget, it came as a remnant, in a sense, onto the throne. There was Caesar, the pagan empire, rolling on the throne. Now he said, now you step into the throne and carry on. And I want us to remember this, because what's really happened is, you know, in Daniel 7, it's when it says the judgment set, and then the little horn was destroyed, it says that the other beasts, while their empires came to an end, they were allowed to carry on for a while, words to that effect. What it's really saying is, as I can understand this, is that the influence of ancient Babylon, its culture and its ideas and its beliefs passed on into Persia, and then those ideas that accumulated were passed on into Greece. And when Rome took over, it took on all the baggage of these ancient empires, their pagan concepts and philosophies and practices, and everything came in. And then the church took that baggage on board too when it stepped into Caesar's throne. An historian in Birmingham who attended some of my lectures, he was a Roman Catholic, and he said to me, he said, the problem with the Roman church, it took on a lot of baggage over the years. He acknowledged it. The pagan influences and practices were transported into the Christian church, and therefore they were used to replace some of the major teachings of the Bible. And that's where Sunday comes from. Sunday was the pagan day. It's sacred day. They worshipped the sun. That's why it was called Sun's Day. You understand that? Sun's Day. You had the Pantheon in Rome, where that great altar that stands in St. Peter once stood in the center. And if you go into the Pantheon, which today is a Christian basilica, but it was a pagan temple, and it's called Pantheon because they worshipped all the various planetary gods. And up in the roof is a hole, now a glass window there, but it was a hole. And when the rays of the sun, the shaft of the sunlight came down through that hole onto the altar, the sacrifice was made to the sun. On Monday they worshipped Moon's Day, Tweed's Day, Woden's Day, Thor's Day, Frigga's Day, Saturn's Day. They worshipped Saturn on the 7th day. And these Latin gods with their Latin names, they were anglicized, so we call it Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday. You understand? But in the Bible it's called the first day of the week, the second day, the third day, and so on. In fact, a Hebrew scholar told me it's really the first of the 7, the second of the 7, the third of the 7, so on down through the week, the 6th of the 7th, the 7th day. Instead of the week being linear, it's circular. The Sabbath in the center, everything is linked to that relationship with God. Interesting theology. But let's just come back to what we're saying here. The gathering in. of these influence of the former nations gradually were transferred all the way down. So this little horn power, though it was a little horn, it wasn't insignificant, it was very powerful, exceedingly great, the Bible says. It had such an influence that it controlled the then known world, the Holy Roman Empire. So we can begin to see how Satan in his kingdom of Babylon is now, in the spiritual Babylon, is now seeking to overpower and overthrow the kingdom of Christ. Remember the true philosophy of history, that God is in control. So, summing up here, the symbols of Daniel 8. The two-horned beast, the ram beast, represents Medo-Persia. The male goat that followed it represents the empire of Greece. And then the notable horn between its eyes is representative of the first king, Alexander the Great. And then we have the four horns of the goat, the divisions of the Greek Empire, after that first horn was broken. And the little horn began to emerge out of one of them. That was pagan Rome stretching to the fore there. And then the little horn became exceedingly great and rose up against the Prince of Princes, against Christ, which is papal Rome. The influence of pagan Rome passed through into papal Rome, or ecclesiastical Rome. So you can see how this influence is all tied together, all down through the line of history. Do you follow what I'm saying? Very, very important that we recognize this. Now, what about counterclaims? Somebody was talking to me over lunch about the Jesuits. Yeah, the Jesuits are responsible for putting out a number of false teachings in order to turn attention away from what the Protestant reformers had identified. What I'm teaching you this afternoon and this morning and last week are prophecies that the Protestant reformers recognized. So the Jesuits, they sought to provide an alternative view in order to counteract what the Protestant Reformation would bring into the fore. And just as they had a Protestant Reformation movement, so they introduced, as I showed you this morning, a counter-Reformation movement under Ignatius Loyola. And so they have suggested that Antiochus Epiphanes is the little horn of Daniel 7 and Daniel 8. Well, if it is Antiochus Epiphanes, and it's interesting how so many Protestants even accept that, probably because it's less offensive for them to accept it than to accept what the Bible is showing and history has revealed. If it is Antiochus Epiphanes, then the principle has to apply that we mentioned this morning of those 10 identification marks of the little horn, you remember we looked at. But it also has to apply not only to those, it also has to apply to the evidence that's revealed here in Daniel chapter 8. Does it? Well, let's just have a look. 3 points we need to look at here. The little horn became exceedingly greater than Cyrus or Alexander because it said so. Those 4 empires were not in the power of Alexander, and this little horn was even greater. So was Antiochus Epiphanes greater than Cyrus or Alexander? Well, none of his line came anywhere near as great. He actually himself was anything but great. I'll tell you, he constantly had to pay tribute to Rome. That doesn't sound very great, does it? And he ended up being murdered while attempting to raise money to pay his dues. And what is more, his subjects even called him Antiochus Epiphanes, which means the madman. Does that sound great to you? It doesn't to me. And he was just one amongst many kings, no one specifically important. Pardon me. Secondly, the little horn became exceedingly great towards the south, which is the Egyptian kingdom, toward the east, which is the Seleucid kingdom, I'll come back to that in a minute, and towards the pleasant land, which would be Palestine, because to the Jewish people, that was the pleasant land, all right? And even against Christ, the Prince of Princes. Well, Antiochus Epiphanes, he would have had a job to fulfill the latter one, because he died in the year 164, I think it was, before Christ was born. But his kingdom was part of the Seleucid kingdom. So therefore he could not be leaning or extending out in battle against the east, because he was coming from the east. He belonged to the east. So it doesn't apply there either. And the third aspect is, according to Daniel 7:25 that we looked at this morning, the little horn would reign supreme for 1260 years. Now I find it very difficult to understand how Antiochus Epiphanes could reign for that length of time. He didn't reign for that long, as I put on the screen. He actually reigned for 11 years. He reigned for 11 years. Let me go back, sorry. He reigned for 11 years between 175 and 164 BC. He was born in 215 BC and he died 164. He was only 51 years old when he died. So it falls a little bit short of 1260, doesn't it? So if my mathematics are right, it wasn't possible for Antiochus Epiphanes to be identified. And I can show you more details, and maybe as we move on into the prophecies we'll share a bit more with you. But the only power that meets all the criteria is papal Rome, as it's been defined below. The two-horned ram, Medo-Persia, came, and then that was succeeded by the male goat, representing the Greek Empire. And that notable horn between his eyes was Alexander the Great. When he died, the four horns came in its place, and thus forming the four divisions of the Greek Empire. The little horn then emerged from one of them, representing pagan Rome, that reached out first of all towards the Christians of that earlier period. And then the little horn became exceedingly great as it was put on the throne of Caesar to consolidate the West, and it rose up against Christ, the Prince of Princes. And that's what history reveals to us. Now, friends, the prophecy of Daniel 8, we are introduced to a very, very important vision. The vision of the ram, yes, and the vision of a male goat. But the thing that captured Daniel's attention, and the thing that becomes the main focus of the great prophecies of Daniel from this point, or even from this point onwards, is the little horn power that would seek to destroy the great truths of salvation by replacing them with counterfeit teachings, alternative teachings. And it would be a power that would claim to exercise the prerogatives of Christ. And this morning we noticed in some of the statements how that little horn power has done just that. And dear friends, that's going to be something we're going to extend into the future, because this is what we're going to look at next Sabbath morning in the presentation entitled The Defiling of the Sanctuary. And you will be your eyes will be opened, if they're not open already, as to how these counterfeit teachings have replaced the great and important truths of the Bible concerning Christ and his plan for our redemption. Very, very important subject. And I will share with you, as I promised this morning, next week, some shocking discovery that my wife and I discovered in Peru this year, that we found in the Church of Rome, that has been practiced and taught out there. And I'll share something else that's now rising up in Africa as well. I showed it you this morning, you read it. It's interesting, dear friends, how these pagan practices have taken over. And it seems as though the devil's kingdom is gaining ground, and Satan's kingdom is and Christ's kingdom is losing. But remember, in the great and the important true philosophy of history, who's going to conquer in the end? Jesus, his kingdom, because God is in control. And you and I, dear friends, while we may be shocked, we may be concerned, we may be disturbed, while we may even be upset, by the things that have happened and that are happening and that prophecy says will happen yet, we can rejoice in the knowledge that Christ is the victor, and when we belong to Jesus and we're truly in a right and proper relationship with him, we're going to have the victory with Jesus because he's already won the victory. And his wounds, his marks that he bears in his body and in his head where the crown of thorns were, and the nail prints in his wrists and in his ankles, and the lash marks that lacerated his flesh, those wounds, dear friends, are the trophies of his victory that he won in that great conflict between Satan and himself. I know whose side I want to be on, don't you? And by his grace, we're going to be there and share that kingdom with him. Pastor, please come and offer our closing prayer for us. Remember, next week we're going to have a look at the defiling of the sanctuary and then the judgment in the afternoon. Thank you, brother.
Let us pray. Heavenly Father, we again want to thank you for the book of Daniel. And Lord, so many things today have been said and have come out. And yet, Lord, we also know that, as Pastor Walker was saying, we need to keep our eyes fixed on you, the author and the finisher of our faith. Lord, help us to keep our eyes fixed on you, that when